In this week's episode, in part one, we look at the re-emergence of APT-29. A group's new campaign uses Cobalt Strike Beacon. We look at what Cobalt Strike is and how cracked versions are shared online between threat actors. In part two, building on this, we look at what defenders can learn from all of this threat actor activity. We outline how we've mapped the ASD Essential 8 to MITRE attack so that defenders can better learn how they can make informed decisions about their defenses. All in this week's Shadow Talk. Hello and welcome to another episode of Shadow Talk. This week joining me, we've got Richard Gold. Hello, Rich.
Hey, Mike. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And also from the security engineering team, we've got the return of Simon Hall. Simon, it's been a while. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Mike. Yourself?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. Great to have you two joining me today. And today I'm going to talk about the re-emergence of APT-29, their use of Cobalt Strike, and then also how we can learn more about what attackers are doing and help that inform our own defenses. So without further ado, let's start by the re-emergence of APT-29, also known as Cozy Bear. We've been focusing on APT-28 for quite a while, and APT-29 seemed to have been pretty quiet. The news this week coming out from FireEye that they were coming with a new campaign spoofing the US Department of State. And what interesting about this was that obviously it was the usual phishing campaign, but they were using the Cobalt Strike Beacon payload. Rich, Simon, does anybody want to tell me exactly what Cobalt Strike is?
So Cobalt Strike is a threat emulation platform, as it's called, by Raphael Mudge, its creator. So it dates back to Armitage, which was originally a GUI for Metasploit back in the day, and since then has evolved into a really quite amazing toolkit for conducting offensive operations. Its primary focus is on post-exploitation, so it's got lots of features around the beacon implant itself, customizable, what they call malleable C2, so you can emulate different types of threat actors. It's got all kinds of functionality for in-memory evasion, also lots of really interesting C2 methods like DNS, SMB namepipe pivoting, and is generally a bit of a favorite tool of the security engineering team.
We talk about the attackers using this. Obviously, it's a legitimate piece of software. How common is it for attackers to use a legitimate piece of software such as Cobalt Strike?
These days, there's so much off-the-shelf tooling, and there's no need to actually go out there and create your own set, because everything's pretty much free. I mean, when you see like Cobalt Strike, there's cracks for it out there. Always easy moddable, so someone can just pull it down, get a copy, change it up, and then use it for their own campaigns. The only difference is with these pre-existing tools is that they're actually easy to identify, unless you actually use the malleable C2 profiles like Rich was talking about. So you can actually change up the patterns and behavior of the traffic.
Okay, and you mentioned there, as a nice segue, the cracked versions that are available for attackers. Expertly done, Simon, because we do have a blog published yesterday on the attackers' use of Cobalt Strike and using and sharing these cracked versions. We've talked for a long while about how attackers are moving from kind of dark web pages and marketplaces, and a lot of them are transacting on Telegram, and that's exactly what we've seen, hasn't it been, Richard?
Yeah, so one of our Russian-speaking security consultants was cruising around and found this rather interesting channel on Telegram where people are sharing information about how to crack Cobalt Strike and also how to use it as well. So it seems that people are getting hold of the trial version of Cobalt Strike, which you have to sign up for, so it's not freely available online, right? There is like a speed bump you've got to get over in order to get hold of it. But some people have either managed to do that or they've stolen it from someone else or something like this. And then they are sharing also cracks to remove the copy protection. And also Cobalt Strike has a whole bunch of identifiers in the trial version. So you'll be picked up immediately by any kind of decent defense system. For example, the ICAR test string, which is used to test antivirus or anti-malware solutions, is embedded into the Cobalt Strike beacon for the trial version. So that will immediately get you picked up anywhere. So some of the cracks are there also to remove these kind of telltale indicators which are present in the trial version.
Yeah, so the interesting thing with the trial is that pretty much every training course out there these days are actually using Cobalt Strike. So they all contain a trial copy of it. So it is fairly easy to obtain that kind of trial TGZ file.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you mentioned is the different support you've got for different languages. So certainly a global interest in this. In terms of the Cobalt Strike, the team servers, there were some interesting finds that your team had around that. Do you want to talk about that, exactly what the team servers are and what we found there?
Yeah, sure. So one of the really great features with Cobalt Strike is that it allows for collaboration. You can log into, you have one team server for an operation, and then all the different operators which are participating in the operation can then log into the same team server, share credentials, share shells, that is sessions on remote hosts, all that kind of stuff. So it's really effective for group work, as the hints in the name, the team server. And we found that some people have been setting up team servers which are publicly accessible from the internet, and also leaving things such as keylogs, logging of keylogs, and all this kind of stuff just lying around. So yeah, attackers also be pretty careless, or the old saying, "The cobbler's children have no shoes."
I've heard that one before, Rich. Always good. Now, what I'm interested by this, and it's obviously quite interesting when threat actors are sharing different types of tools online, and it's cool to see how that happens. How does that help organizations to understand how they can better protect themselves?
I think, kind of as we was discussing, each of these tools, they had their own identifiers and kind of, I guess, methods of use. So with Cobalt Strike, there's set actions you can do with it, I guess. So there's options for lateral movement, there's options for privilege escalation, and everything else. And while you can add additional scripts to modify this and add extra behavior to it, it gives you a really nice list that you can then start setting some mitigations against.
Yeah, exactly. I think what's really interesting and useful with this kind of stuff is that you can see, right, well, Cobalt Strike is a very well-known tool set. There's a lot of information about it online. Raphael Mudge has an amazing course, Advanced Threat Tactics, available for free on his webpage with all YouTube videos and everything, detailing, very, very nicely how Cobalt Strike can be used, what kind of capabilities it has. And that's a great place to start if you're defending a network. You take a very well-known, very popular tool set with decent set of capabilities, and you figure out what it can do and how that maps to your controls. So, the SMB name pipe pivoting, can you see that, for example? How would you detect that? The DNS-C2, are you monitoring your DNS traffic? Do you have insight to that? How, it has a built-in couple of techniques for privilege escalation, this kind of stuff. So you get to already look at a pretty good attack lifecycle by just reviewing Cobalt Strike's functionality. And then you can see, from blogs and from YouTube videos and so on, like how operators typically use it. And that gives you, in my opinion, a great place to start for seeing, can I detect a pretty sophisticated system, offensive system on my network. Now, the difference is, of course, who is using it, right? Because it's very different if you would have Raphael Mudge himself, red teaming your network with Cobalt Strike. It's going to be very different to some like random script kiddie somewhere doing it.
Yeah, precisely. And I mean, these tools also act as a great way of evaluating new software solutions for your infrastructure. If you're looking at new endpoint solutions and stuff like this, actually taking one of these well-used platforms and actually executing it, as Rich says, into your environment will give you a good idea. So if you want to evaluate 3 different endpoint solutions for your network, if you take one of these kind of platforms like Cobalt Strike and start running some of the lateral movement, some of the privilege escalation, some of the other methods in there, you can actually test to see how well these solutions work out.
Okay, that's perfect. Thanks, chaps. And I think that's all for part 1. In part 2, we're We're going to talk about more ways that we can learn about the activities of threat actors and how we can inform our own defenses about that. Hey listeners, hope you're enjoying Shadow Talk. Just a quick note to our regular listeners to say don't forget to subscribe and please rate us on iTunes. Okay, welcome to part 2. Thanks to Richard and Simon for providing an overview of Cobalt Strike, the uses and how we can defend against that. In part 2, I want to talk now about MITRE ATT&CK. Once again, we've brought together all of our analyses of different groups. We've mapped those against different tactics, and then we've managed to combine that with the ASD Essential 8 to give a really good idea of where people should start focusing their defenses. So first of all, I think it's probably worth discussing what is the ASD Essential 8.
Sure. The ASD Essential 8 is a set of really pragmatic, battle-tested security mitigations that are achievable for many organizations. That's what I think is so great about it, what I like so much. It really boils it down to, unsurprisingly, the essentials. I think this is, rather than being overly ambitious and having, a list of, 50, 100 different security controls, which, probably would help, they've really boiled it down to the stuff that really is the most important. And I think that an organization like the ASD having a very strong offensive side has enabled them to really come up with the top 8 defense mitigations, which would really cause them problems as attackers. And it's very, very straightforward stuff. Application whitelisting, disabling macros or controlling the execution of macros in your environment, hardening your operating systems and your applications, patching, and this kind of stuff. So it's, nothing crazy, nothing, esoteric, I suppose, but it's all very pragmatic stuff. It doesn't mean that it's easy to deploy and to consistently get right. Let me make that very clear. But it is, this getting the fundamentals in place, the foundational pieces in place, so you have a solid security program.
Yeah, precisely. I think Richard's pretty much nailed it there. Coming from a network security and architecture background myself, it's quite easy to see all of these organizations trying to focus on getting a solution for everything for the network, spending money and all of their budget they can on buying the latest all-in-one solution or multiple solutions for the network, where they should be focusing on a lot of the kind of basic stuff, like because what the Essential 8 actually touches on is, kind of looking at mitigating macros, as Rich said, and lateral movement. Some of these things can actually be fixed and resolved quite easily, rather than spending your annual budget on a new solution.
Yeah, there's a really good point there, which is a lot of the stuff you can do from the Essential 8 doesn't require a new appliance or a new service. It's making sense of the things which are already in place and having good processes in place. So that's what I mean. It's difficult to get it right consistently, but it's not an issue of like, I've got to spend more money because I don't have XYZ blinky box.
Yeah, exactly. And all of these mitigations are heavily documented as well. So it's not like you need to go out there and employ a new administrator to deploy these. Your staff in-house are most likely capable of getting hold of the documentation from one of a million sources, reading through them and implementing some of these.
Okay, so I guess that explains my next question to some extent, which is why the ASD to map to MITRE ATT&CK? Is there a particular reason that makes it good? I guess you pointed towards the fact that these are some actions that are pretty easy, or these are some actions that security teams can pretty quickly take. Was there any other logic behind taking ASD Essential 8?
Yeah, it's straightforward, but not easy. There are organizations which are, for example, completely dependent on the usage of macros in their environment for their business. And we can't blithely say, oh, just disable macros, job done. There's a lot more behind that you can yeah, and I know of companies that have spent months just trying to get on top of which macros that they have or who uses them. So it's not, we should really emphasize that I don't want you to trivialize things, but they are still more straightforward security controls, understandable security controls than, quantum big data in the cloud. I think the other thing, so for why I chose it, I think it's the most practical and the sort of the minimal set. It's as simple and as minimal as it needs to be, and no simpler. And as I say, it's, in my opinion, it's clearly motivated by deep offensive experience. And that's something which really appeals to me.
Okay. And but perhaps not really a big surprise is across all of the campaigns that we looked at, spear phishing was a common thread. Were there any surprises in some of the tactics that were being used when we looked at it on more of the macro view?
Not particularly. I think that the tradecraft which many actors are using, even these kind of like APT groups like GRU and so on, it's all fairly standard in the sort of, at this level, in the sort of technique level. They use spear phishing, they use valid accounts, exploiting trusted relationships, that kind of stuff. There's a few interesting bits here and there about like C2. There's sometimes a bit of unusual tricks being used in the C2 sides of things. But generally speaking, the tradecraft is pretty much what we've seen for a long time. And there shouldn't really be any surprises. The thing is that these groups like the GRU and others, Fin7, it's how they do it. They are really persistent. They're really motivated. They know their targets. They're going after the processes, the weak processes. They're targeting the people. They really know how to attack. And I think that's really, people use spear phishing because it works, because it really is just effective, as we know ourselves in our own organization from the phishing campaigns that we've done. So we know it works, and that's why attackers use it. And as I say, the difference is really not what they were doing, but how they did it.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to say is that these product solutions just work, and I think the skill and everything else they put into it is down to the human side of things and kind of profiling an organization, and that's where a lot of time and effort comes into, as we've touched on the podcast.
One question I have, and this is from a long-time listener of the podcast, around this issue, is that often when you get one of these APT campaigns and you start mapping the TTPs to kind of find gaps in your own defenses, often because there are so many TTPs employed, it can be quite overwhelming. So it can almost be a demoralizing experience, because you're like, well, where on earth do I start here? Have you got any advice for those people that may be starting to use this type of technique to inform their defenses, with how you can best prioritize defenses on when you've got so much information coming?
I think that there are, the basics as described in the Essential 8 are really the right place to start. They talk about doing the hardening of the endpoints. That's a really important place to start. They're talking about controlling, what scripting, scripting systems you can have in your environment. They talk about patching. So I think it's really the things that they talk about in the Essential 8 program are really a great place to start. And yeah, you're going to have to eventually choose something, and to get started on, probably controlling the execution of code in your environment is probably a really good place to start. And then, but you're always going to have to touch on, you're going to have to, the lateral movement side of things, privilege escalation. You are going to have to be concerned about these things. But, the Essential 8, I think, is a great way to sort of even kickstart that process.
Yeah, and I think for me, the lateral movement is probably one of the key things there. The endpoint stuff is really important, but if you've got access to one endpoint, and you can isolate that endpoint, then you kind of reduce a lot of the risk there. With the lateral movement side of things, network segregation, and access controls, that's a big piece of it.
Okay, thanks, chaps. I think that wraps up today's pod. But first of all, I'm going to go to each of you and ask for a key takeaway. Richard.
I think one of the things that was the most interesting for me with the ASD Essential 8 was seeing not only what it covered, but what it didn't cover. So it covers really well the sort of the middle of the attack life cycle. Code execution, lateral movement, privilege escalation, these things, it's really got those covered. But the planning of the attack or the preparation of the infrastructure, like the creation of typo-scot domains and things like that, were not really captured by the Essential 8. So that's an additional monitoring opportunity, I think, for some organizations. The other thing was the more like the end of the kill chain. So the actions on target for the attackers to like exfiltrate data out of an organization, theft documents, intellectual property, ransoming, crypto mining, whatever. So there's also monitoring opportunities there towards the end of the kill chain to look for that anomalous behavior which corresponds to adversary activity.
I think for me, it just comes back to, as I say, with the Essential 8 is just looking at the small changes that make the larger difference, rather than going out and buying all of the products that you think are going to solve all of the issues that you don't actually have as an organization, which I think is a big thing, because everyone is scared of the boogeyman out there, but they're actually, most of the problems that they're seeing in the news won't affect them. And it does come down to these small kind of tweaks to your network and configuration that will actually make the biggest difference.
Actually, I'm just going to follow up on that as well. I think it's a really good point. In our experience, we've had success, I think, where we've managed to get the controls in as early as possible. And I think we've managed to dodge quite a few bullets just by very early on saying, no, we're not going to do that. And that's really been helpful. And of course, many organizations are not in that position because they've got a lot of legacy stuff to take care of. But in cases where you're building something new, the earlier you get your security decisions in place, the better it will be, in my opinion.
100%, yeah.
What a great note to end on. Thanks, chaps. Thanks for joining.
Pleasure as always.
Wow, in sync. Love it. And thank you at home for listening. Have a great week.